Welcome to Biblical Foundations, a podcast of the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm your co-host, Jimmy Rowe, along with Dr. Andreas Kostenberger. Join us as we discuss issues in biblical scholarship for the church.
Now let's maybe move on to your second chapter, which presumably your second lecture, which has the subtitle Bauer and Boltman Redux. And again, as you know, there's multiple Bauers. Here we're talking about F.C. Bauer, B-A-U-R, not Walter Bauer. So why don't you introduce our listeners briefly to F.C. Bauer and Boltman as well, especially because what you say in that chapter is you've seen a renewed interest in these two German scholars in recent years. So, how do you explain their appeal? And perhaps with regard to Bauer, since we've already been talking about pastoral epistles, maybe you could give us a bit of a taste of his scholarship. I seem to remember you talk about his pastoralist commentary, in German, the so-called pastoral epistles in chapter 2 of your book.
Yes. Well, that's an interesting book because, it functions as a commentary, but it's not a commentary. It's a very closely argued, I think about 140 page, in the smaller Gothic script, about 140 page book that its sole purpose is to argue that Paul didn't write the Pastoral Letters.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's one of his earlier books, and it's a book that at that time he had to be very careful that he not be real forthright about what he was proposing.
That's right.
And so the sentences are very dense and very long. And as you know, back then, actually this was in the 1830s, early 1840s, a lot of German scholars at that time still wrote their doctoral dissertations in Latin.
Yeah. And I seem to remember that David Friedrich Strauss, writing in 1835, he actually lost his university post, didn't he, because of some of his views? So that was a very precarious time.
Yeah, and he was a student of F.C. Bauer.
Yeah.
So F.C. Bauer had to be careful. And by the way, F.C. Bauer threw him under the bus. He did not come to his student's defense. But F.C. Bauer had to be, sort of guarded in how he stated things. And the way they did that is they used prose that was so complex and definitions and words that were so technical that average German speakers, without that training and indoctrination, really couldn't understand what these people were saying.
Yeah.
So anyway, F.C. Bauer was born in 1792. He was born in Swabia in southwest Germany. He was came up in Bible-believing Lutheran circles. But sometime in his university training, one third or slightly more of all university students in the whole German university system in the 1820-25 range, over one third were theology students in Protestant faculties. So F.C. Bauer is one of these, thousands and thousands of theology students, pastoral students. But something happened, which I've never gotten to the bottom of, and his views switched, and he became eventually post-Christian. And he's popular. He has been popular. He's been fought against. He was fought against then, and he's been fought against by conservatives throughout the generations. But he spearheaded the elitist approach to reading the New Testament.
Yeah.
And two broad ways he did this. Number one, he ended up using the conceptuality of the most popular philosophy of the day, who was Hegel. He used Hegel's philosophy as sort of a hermeneutical grid, and I know there's controversy among specialists. Did he really use Hegel? And I'm just going to say yes, he really did use Hegel in the end. And this has become, the way to do biblical scholarship is you don't take that hermeneutical grid of Christian teaching like the Trinity and the divinity of Christ and the authority of Scripture and so forth. You take the grid of reality or truth from the philosophy faculty that's most dominant, and you apply that to the Bible, and then that makes your reading critical. And F.C. Bauer spearheaded that. He also spearheaded the view that it's not what the Bible says on the surface that we're really after when we interpret the Bible. What we're after is the reason it says that. Why does it say that? In other words, there's something behind the text that's not actually what the text asserts, that is the correct interpretation of the Bible.
Yeah.
So, his writings, in just 3 or 4 years ago, his New Testament theology came out in English, and it's called Lectures on New Testament Theology. It's here on my desk, and it's published by Oxford University Press. And you can read it, and as you read it, you see that time and time again, when he interprets parts of the Bible, you're just astounded. Like, he interprets the Sermon on the Mount in terms of Kant's categorical imperative.
Yeah.
The meaning of the Sermon on the Mount is not what Jesus says, which, there's a lot there. I won't even try to summarize it. It really boils down to, you should do what you know you ought to do.
Right.
That's the meaning of the Sermon on the Mount. So, F.C. Bauer, as I say, he has been opposed by scholars through the centuries, but as Western churches and Western societies have become more and more post-Christian and more liberal in their theological views, F.C. Bauer is viewed as sort of the father of our approach to the Bible if we don't want to pay attention and be under the authority of what it says on the surface. If we want to find something behind it that we think is the deeper truth that we're going to urge on people from the Bible, if we pay attention to the Bible at all. So F.C. Bauer is sort of a patron saint of that hermeneutical approach.
It also sounds a little bit like a precursor to this hermeneutic of suspicion, some sort of skeptical approach where you feel like you have to almost like distrust the motives, and maybe the ideology behind the biblical writers. You can't just take it at face value. They had either maybe sinister motives or because they actually believe that stuff, they can't be trusted, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And, it reminds me of what you said a few minutes ago, Dr. Kirstenberger, about, Jesus studies. Going back to the 1780s, 1790s, scholars going back to at least Lessing began to talk about the Gospels in terms of documents that conceal much more than they reveal. The Jesus really didn't talk like this. He was speaking in Aramaic. We have these Greek documents, and there were all these theories. Source criticism came in. Where did the gospel writers, whoever they were, where did they get these views, and what really happened to cause them to write this? So that was a hermeneutic of suspicion a couple generations before Bauer. And then Bauer's key word that he used was the German word Tendenz. There's this bias. There's this sort of pressure that the writer is responding to. He's not talking about Jesus' resurrection because he actually witnessed Jesus risen from the dead. There's some agenda that they have that's causing them to say this. And that's what biblical criticism is so important for, because when you read the Bible, you think it's saying X, Y, and Z, but actually it's not saying hardly anything that's on the surface. What really gave rise to these writings is something, underneath that's more in line with truth that we can discover. So you're exactly right that this is a suspicious approach to Scripture. But you wanted to know about Boltman too.
Right. Well, I was just about to ask. Perhaps it'd be helpful for our listeners if you could introduce Boltman's dialectical theology, his demythologizing approach, and what do contemporary critical scholars find so appealing in Boltman?
Sure. Well, Boltman was born in 1884, and he died in 1976.
Not that long ago.
And not that long ago at all. And he's credited with being the most influential New Testament scholar of the 20th century internationally. So that's one reason he's appealing today. It's just out of respect for his intellectual stature in the previous century. And since the time, you might say, of Boltman's supremacy in the 50s and 60s and 70s of last century, no single figure has replaced him that sort of is viewed as the dominant godfather of biblical studies. So people, I think, look back at his era with a little bit of nostalgia. Remember when it was so simple that there was this one main idea out there, and now it's kind of fragmented, and we wish it could be more simple like it used to be. But he's popular among scholars today, number one, because they agree with his skepticism toward a Christian reading of the Bible. The word you mentioned, Jimmy, demythologizing. And in that view, just to kind of repeat some things that are a part of the way that Bauer read the Bible. And scholars have observed, actually Boltman has very important resonances with F.C. Bauer and his approach. By demythologizing, what Boltman was saying is, look, when we look at the Bible, you could understand things like, it teaches about the Trinity, and it teaches about miracles, and teaches about an incarnation and a virgin birth. He called that rubbish. Those things are rubbish. We have to, they're myths. They never could have been true. So we have to demythologize the Bible. When we go to the Bible, when we see stuff like that, we got to see through it to something deeper. Mm-hmm. And so, first point, they agree with Boltman's skepticism toward a Christian reading of the Bible. Secondly, scholars often today, they affirm, and while they don't imitate Boltman's existentialist philosophy preference and his association with Martin Heidegger, they do imitate what I'll call his syncretistic hermeneutic. And by that I mean you take a secular dogmatic framework, and by dogmatic I just mean it functions kind of as a religion. Like you mentioned, Andres Derrida. There's a Derridaian reading, or there's a Freudian reading, or there's a Marxist reading, or there's a queer reading, or some other kind of a critical theory. That's not a constellation of Christian convictions. These are convictions foreign to the biblical writings. But you use these convictions to provide your cognitive touch points in your mind and in your thinking. You're going to, as a Marxist, you're going to read the Bible and interpret it in Marxist terms. So I'll call that a current academic ideology. And then you call that critical. And Boltman was a genius at reading the Bible through a philosophical conceptuality that was foreign to the convictions of the biblical writers. Like, they thought that Jesus really was why they were writing. And so, Andres, as you recall, when Adolf Schlatter, who believed the Bible, when he wrote a New Testament theology, he wrote 500 pages on Jesus and the Gospels.
That's right. And
then he wrote a volume 2. In Boltman's New Testament theology, he's done with Jesus on page 30.
Page 3 almost.
Yeah, there's almost nothing about Jesus in his New Testament theology.
Yep.
Because he has an ideology that number one discounts the historicity of the Gospels, but number two is after an understanding of existence, which he thinks he finds in Paul and parts of John, and that's really all that's of interest to Boltman in the New Testament, is this self-understanding, believing self-understanding. So, in summary, Boltman is popular among many today. I'm not saying that nobody critiques him. I'm not saying that people, are following him blindly. I'm saying they do tend to agree with his skepticism toward a Christian reading of the Bible. And number two, they do tend to imitate his syncretistic hermeneutic. They borrow a conceptuality from the current mindset, and they apply that to reading the Bible. And Boltman pioneered that for the Western University.
I think it's fascinating even to see the connection then, where you talk about Bauer and Boltman redux, and you mentioned that Bauer, chose to interpret the New Testament through Kantian philosophy, and Boltman, uses Heidegger and existentialist philosophy. So even though the philosophers differ, that approach of reading the Bible through kind of an extraneous philosophical framework remained the same. And then, people like Strauss being a bit of a figure that logically culminated in Boltman with his idea of religious myth. Talking about Boltman, I once had a chance in Oxford to visit with John Ashton, whom I think you know as well, and he wrote a book on the history of the interpretation of John's Gospel called "Understanding the Fourth Gospel," and in that he has three parts: before Boltman, Boltman, and after Boltman. And I think that's a tribute to, his towering stature in the 20th century. And so I'm intrigued to hear you talk about the fact that he, even though many of his individual views have been debunked, he still holds, quite a bit of contemporary appeal, to this very day, just because of the broader hermeneutical approach that people find attractive. This idea of the critical, ideological reading.
There is often a phenomenon, the drift in the academy is consistently, kind of away from confessional Christianity. And I think of in politics, if you're a Republican, you might think back to Reagan all the time. Or if you're a Democrat, you might think back to, FDR all the time. Mm-hmm. And when you actually look into Reagan or FDR, there might be a lot of things you could say, that wasn't so good. Mm-hmm. But for your movement's purpose, it doesn't really matter what's not so good. They stand for something. Yeah. And they're like a rallying point. And I see Boltman as that rallying point for a lot of New Testament scholars. Even though a lot of his positions have just been totally dismantled, he still stands for something that everybody kind of rallies around.
Yeah, that's right. Now, moving on to your third chapter, you asked the question that I'm sure some of our listeners might be asking, is there any middle ground? I think you say, is rapprochement possible? Is there any way for populists to make common cause with elitists, or at least, to perhaps adopt anything that might be useful in this more elitist approach? What's your answer, and why?
Well, I'll define rapprochement as a resumption of harmonious relations.
Good.
Because, in a sense, what's happened, and Andres, you mentioned this a while ago, is that the critical view has distanced itself from the reading of the Bible in churches. And so, the question is there any way to bring things closer back together? And, there are a number of strategies that people use. So let me give you a short answer. Yes and no. Okay. There is a possibility, I think, of coming back together, but only under certain conditions. One approach that evangelical scholars have used to sort of close the gap is I'll call it apostasy. Just give in and admit that the elitist view is right, and go to war against what you used to believe. So that's one option. And in my book I mentioned David Congdon. Mm-hmm. Bart Ehrman is another example. Those are both Wheaton College graduates who at one time signed on as sort of confessing Christians, but now have rejected Christian faith. If the price of rapprochement, if the price of coming together with critical scholarship is giving up your Christian confession, well, that's not acceptable. There's another approach that people use, and that is just you could say, scorched earth, and I'll call it unhelpful polemical denunciation. Mm-hmm. Some people approach critical study because of its problems. They just denounce it. And I think here of people who argue against any Bible but the King James Version because they think, the Textus Receptus was willed by God and anything else is from the devil. Mm-hmm. So, that's a total rejection of rapprochement, and I don't think that's the approach either. But in between that, there's kind of a spectrum. There's an approach that some use, I'll call it bifurcation. You maintain your personal Christian beliefs, but in public you go along with the rules and the norms of the academy. And I don't really recommend that as a strategy for closing the gap. In other words, act like you're going along with them, but go to church on Sunday and in your quiet time say, God, I still believe. I just can't really put my head up too high or it'll get shot off. There's another way that there can be rapprochement, and I do respect this way. I've known scholars who are evangelicals and they do go to church and they don't hide it, but they don't maybe like join the Evangelical Theological Society, and their strategy is to destabilize the hegemony. So kind of work from the inside and try to publish things that are somewhat subversive of the consensus, and hope that they can, sort of be a Christian missionary undercover behind enemy lines, so to speak. And I respect people who feel called, to work within the academy like that. Another approach is what I'll call strategic engagement. And I think there can be rapprochement if we work within the confessional orbit. So you teach at Midwestern, or you teach at Covenant, or you teach at Trinity. But of course, you read what non-evangelicals write. You learn from what the elitists are saying. You interact with it. You may speak at conferences, or you may write in forums where that academy is in the driver's seat. But, strategically, you engage what's there. I think there can be a lot of, making common cause and constructive dialogue with scholars that are elitist if we do our homework and if we don't lose our souls in the process of interacting with them. Then there's another approach, which I'll call focus on receptive audiences. And Andres, you mentioned writing for the church. And many scholars realize that non-elitist views are just not welcome in certain circles. On the other hand, there are all kinds of places that need solid scholarship. And it's the kind of scholarship that you really need to go and get a doctorate to be able to do. And it may be in North America, it may be in Africa, it may be in Brazil, it may be in Hong Kong, at least the old Hong Kong. But given the explosion of the Christian population around the globe in recent generations, there's real need for writing, and there's real need for teaching the Bible, and for leadership equipping and leadership training in parts of the world where we don't need to import, the knowledge of this skeptical view. It's probably already there, but really people need to be grounded in the first or second generations, in the Christian tradition and the Christian scriptures. So I think there can be rapprochement in the sense that we learn from, the history of critical study, and we learn the best of what critical scholars do, which generally there is something of value in all but the most skeptical scholarship. Learn all we can from it, but not be subverted by it, and use the critical discussion to sharpen our own teaching and our own writing and our own equipping of Christian leaders in parts of the world that really want to know, what does the Bible say, and how can we transmit that to our people, many of whom are in their first generation of Christian life. Like in Africa, there have been hundreds of millions of people come into the church in the last 40, 50 years. How do you ground them in the scriptures when, for centuries, they've had nothing of the scriptures, or very little of the scriptures in their cultural setting?
Well, Dr. Yarbrough, we thank you so much for this fascinating conversation, and appreciate your work, and look forward to seeing you on campus here at Midwestern in the coming year. And so we're grateful for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today at Biblical Foundations. For more information, please visit the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern at cbs.mbts.edu. For further resources, please also visit biblicalfoundations.org. Please join us again next time at the Biblical Foundations podcast.